There is a moment in the Bible so shocking that many people skip past it. A moment where God gives an order that sounds almost unbelievable. Not defeat them, not punish them, but erase them. A whole nation, a whole bloodline, men, women, children, even their animals, everything. And the command came directly from God. Now pause for a moment and think about that, because this raises a question that makes many people deeply uncomfortable. What kind of people could become so evil, so dangerous, that God himself decides they can no longer exist on the earth? This wasn't a sudden decision. It wasn't a moment of anger. It was the end of a story that had been unfolding for centuries. A story filled with cruelty, ambushes in the desert, attacks on the weak, and a hatred so relentless that generation after generation kept choosing the same path. And eventually, God said something terrifying. Their memory would be wiped out from under heaven. But here's what makes this story even more intense. When the moment finally came to carry out that judgment, the king chosen to do it hesitated. Just a little, just enough. And that one moment of hesitation allowed something dangerous to survive. Something that would come back hundreds of years later and almost destroy God's people completely. So tonight we're uncovering the full story behind one of the most controversial commands in the entire Bible. The truth about the Amalekites, who they were, what they did, and why God decided their bloodline had reached its end. But as we walk through this story together, there's a deeper question waiting at the center of it all. A question you may still be thinking about by the end of this video. Was this destruction cruelty, or was it the final act of justice after centuries of evil? Now, let's go back to the desert, to a moment when a group of raiders made a decision that would seal the fate of their bloodline forever. Chapter 1, the attack God never forgot. Picture the scene for a moment. A massive group of people is moving slowly through the wilderness. Dust rises with every step. Children cling to their mothers. Elderly men lean on wooden staffs just to keep walking. Animals bleat and stumble in the heat. This is not an army marching to conquer land. This is a nation of former slaves trying to survive. Only weeks earlier, these people had witnessed one of the most dramatic events in human history, the Exodus from Egypt. For more than 4 centuries, the Israelites had lived under brutal oppression. They built cities they would never own, carried bricks under the burning sun, and lived under the constant shadow of their masters. But everything changed when God raised up a reluctant leader named Moses. Through signs, plagues, and wonders that shook an empire, God forced Pharaoh to release them. And then came the moment that still echoes through history. When the waters of the Red Sea parted, walls of water rising on both sides, a pathway opening through the sea itself. The Israelites crossed to freedom, while the army that had enslaved them was swallowed by the returning waves. But freedom didn't mean safety. Now they were in the wilderness, a harsh and unforgiving world where survival itself was a daily struggle. Food was uncertain, water was scarce, and most importantly, they had no real army. Remember this. These were not seasoned warriors. They were farmers, laborers, shepherds, craftsmen, people who had spent generations making bricks, not fighting battles. And among them were thousands who could barely keep up with the journey, the elderly, the injured, pregnant women, children too young to understand why their world had suddenly changed. At the very back of this massive traveling camp were the weakest members of the nation, the ones who walked slower, the ones who had to stop and rest more often, the ones who struggled to keep up with the long line of travelers stretching across the desert. And that is exactly where the attackers came. Far away from the Israelite camp, another group of people had been watching, a fierce desert tribe known as the Amalekites. They were descendants of Amalek, and they had survived for generations as nomadic raiders of the wilderness. They knew the desert better than anyone. They moved fast, they struck suddenly, and they survived by attacking vulnerable targets, caravans, travelers, stragglers, anyone who looked weak enough to rob. When they saw the massive group of Israelites moving slowly across the wilderness, They didn't see a miracle. They saw an opportunity. But what they did next crossed a line that would echo through history. Instead of confronting Israel face to face in open battle, they attacked the back of the camp. Think about the strategy behind that. They avoided the stronger men. They avoided the leaders. They avoided the center where people could defend themselves. They targeted the weakest people alive, the stragglers, the exhausted, the sick, those who had fallen behind. The Bible records this moment in the book of Deuteronomy, and the description is chilling. It says the Amalekites cut off all the stragglers at your rear. Imagine the panic. A grandmother walking slowly behind the group suddenly hears screams. A mother carrying a child turns to see riders charging from the desert. Chaos erupts. People scatter. The weakest are overtaken first, and one by one they fall. This was not honorable warfare. It was slaughter, a calculated attack on people who couldn't defend themselves. And something else about this moment matters deeply. The Bible says the Amalekites did not fear God. They had heard about what had happened in Egypt, the plagues, the Red Sea, the miracles. Stories like that spread quickly in the ancient world. But instead of fearing the God who had done these things, they chose to prey on his people anyway. And that moment changed everything, because God saw it. Every terrified scream, every innocent life lost in the dust of the desert, nothing escaped his notice. Soon after this attack, something remarkable happened. For the first time since leaving Egypt, Israel was forced to fight back. And the man chosen to lead that defense was a young warrior named Joshua. While Joshua gathered men to fight the Amalekites on the battlefield, something else was happening on a hill nearby. High above the battle stood Moses, and as long as Moses held his hands raised toward heaven, Israel began to win. But when his arms grew tired and started to fall, the Amalekites began to gain the advantage. Eventually, two men stood beside Moses, holding up his arms until sunset. And by the end of that day, Joshua defeated the Amalekite raiders. But the story didn't end there. After the battle, God said something that would become one of the most haunting declarations in the entire Bible. Through Moses, God announced a future judgment recorded in the book of Exodus. He said, "I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." Think about that for a moment. God didn't just promise defeat, he promised erasure. Their name, their legacy, their memory, gone. But here's something deeply important. God didn't carry out that judgment immediately. Instead, he waited. Not for a few years, not even for a generation. He waited hundreds of years. Why would God wait that long? Was it patience? Was it mercy? Or was God giving the Amalekites time to change the path they had chosen? Because what most people don't realize is this: that desert ambush was only the beginning. The Amalekites would continue attacking Israel again and again and again throughout the centuries, as if their hatred had become part of their identity. And eventually, God would choose a king to carry out the judgment he had promised long before. But the roots of this hatred go even deeper, because the story of Amalek didn't truly begin in the desert. It began generations earlier, inside a family divided by jealousy, betrayal, and bitterness, a rivalry between two brothers whose descendants would inherit their anger. The brothers were Jacob and Esau, and their conflict would shape the destiny of the Amalekites for generations. But the question is, how did a family rivalry grow into a hatred so deep that it eventually led to the destruction of an entire people? That's where the story takes its next turn. Chapter 2, the hatred that grew across generations. To understand why the Amalekites became such relentless enemies of Israel, we have to go back much further than the desert attack, much further than the wilderness. In fact, we have to go back to a family story, a story about two brothers who were never meant to become enemies, but whose rivalry would echo through generations. Their names were Jacob and Esau, and their story begins even before they were born. The Bible tells us in the book of Genesis that when their mother, Rebekah, was pregnant, something strange happened. The children inside her womb struggled violently against each other. It was so intense that she cried out to God in confusion. "Why is this happening?" And God gave her an answer that sounded almost mysterious. He said 2 nations were inside her, 2 peoples, and they would be divided. One would become stronger than the other, and the older would serve the younger. From the very beginning, their destinies were already moving in different directions. When the twins were finally born, their differences were obvious. Esau came first, rugged, strong, hair covering his body like a wild man of the fields. He grew up to become a hunter, a man who loved the wilderness and the thrill of the chase. Jacob, on the other hand, was quieter, more thoughtful, more patient. He stayed closer to home. Where Esau was impulsive, Jacob was calculating. Where Esau lived for the moment, Jacob thought about the future. And that difference eventually created one of the most famous moments in biblical history. One day, Esau came back from the fields exhausted and starving. Jacob was cooking a pot of stew. The smell filled the air. Esau begged for some food, but Jacob made a shocking offer. He said, "Sell me your birthright." Now, in the ancient world, a birthright meant everything. It meant leadership of the family. It meant inheritance. It meant spiritual blessing and authority passed down through generations. But Esau was hungry and impatient, so he shrugged and said something that would follow his legacy forever. "What good is a birthright to me if I'm dying of hunger?" And just like that, he traded it away for a bowl of stew. It was a moment that revealed something about Esau's character. He valued the present moment more than the future. But the real breaking point came years later. When their father Isaac was old and nearly blind, he prepared to give the official blessing that would pass the family authority to Esau. But through a complicated and controversial moment of deception, Jacob received that blessing instead. And when Esau discovered what had happened, his heartbreak turned into fury. The Bible describes the moment with raw emotion. Esau cried out loudly and bitterly. He begged his father for another blessing, but the moment had already passed. And from that day forward, Esau carried something heavy in his heart: hatred. The book of Genesis tells us that Esau even began planning to kill his brother once their father died. Jacob had to flee for his life, and although the 2 brothers would later meet again in a moment of uneasy reconciliation, the damage between their descendants had already begun. Because families grow into tribes, tribes grow into nations. Jacob's descendants would become the people of Israel. But Esau's descendants formed a different group known as Edom, and within that family line, generations later, another name appeared, a man named Amalek. Amalek was the grandson of Esau through Esau's son Eliphaz, and from Amalek came a tribe that would eventually grow into a fierce desert people, the Amalekites. They lived in the harsh regions of the desert, a brutal environment that shaped brutal people. Life in those lands demanded toughness, strength, and sometimes cruelty. Over time, the Amalekites developed a reputation that spread across the ancient world. They were raiders, nomadic warriors who attacked vulnerable travelers in caravans. They struck quickly, disappeared into the desert, and lived by taking from others. Generation after generation grew up hearing the same stories. Stories about survival, stories about enemies, stories about the people of Israel. And whether intentionally or not, the ancient rivalry between Jacob and Esau slowly evolved into something darker, a cultural hatred, a hostility passed down like an inheritance. So when the Amalekites saw the Israelites traveling through the wilderness after the Exodus, they didn't see distant relatives. They saw opportunity. They saw weakness. They saw people they had every reason to despise. And so they attacked. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly throughout the centuries. The Amalekites became a kind of shadow enemy to Israel. Whenever Israel was vulnerable, they appeared. In the time of the Judges, the Amalekites joined forces with other tribes to invade the land. They swept across the countryside like locusts, destroying crops, taking livestock, leaving entire communities starving. The Bible describes these invasions in the book of Judges, where they teamed up with the Midianites to crush Israel's ability to survive. For years, the Israelites hid in caves and mountains just to escape them. Imagine what that does to a nation. Imagine growing up hearing stories of these relentless attackers, a people who never seemed to stop, never seemed to change. Every generation bringing another raid, another battle, another wave of destruction, and through all of it, God remembered the promise he had made long ago in the book of Exodus, the promise that the memory of Amalek would one day be wiped out. But centuries passed, and still the Amalekites continued down the same path, which raises a powerful question. Why didn't God act sooner? Why allow hundreds of years to pass before carrying out the judgment he had promised? Was God waiting, giving them time to change? Or was something even bigger unfolding in the story of Israel? Because eventually the moment would arrive when God decided the time for patience was over, and the man chosen to carry out that command would be the first king Israel had ever known, a man named Saul. But what Saul did next would change the course of history and prove that sometimes partial obedience can be just as dangerous as rebellion. For centuries, the story of the Amalekites had followed the same pattern: attack, disappear, return again. Generations passed, but their hostility toward Israel never seemed to fade. And this is something many people overlook when they read the Bible. The judgment that eventually came upon Amalek was not immediate. It was delayed for hundreds of years. God had spoken about their fate long before in the book of Exodus, declaring that the memory of Amalek would one day be wiped away. But instead of carrying out that judgment instantly, he waited. Think about that. Centuries went by. Entire generations of Amalekites lived and died during that time. Children were born. Families grew. New leaders rose. And throughout all those years, the Amalekites had something incredibly rare in human history: time. Time to change their path. Time to abandon the violence that had defined them. Time to become something different. But the story never changed. Again and again, the Amalekites appeared as enemies of Israel. For the people of Israel, the name Amalek slowly became something more than just an enemy tribe. It became a symbol of relentless cruelty, a people who seemed to exist only to destroy. And still, the years continued to pass, until one day Israel changed. The scattered tribes united under a king for the first time in their history. His name was Saul. At first, Saul looked like the perfect leader. He was tall, strong, impressive in appearance, the kind of man people naturally followed. And during the early years of his reign, he proved himself capable in battle. But Saul's story was about to intersect with a promise God had made centuries earlier. One day, the aging prophet Samuel came to Saul with a message directly from God. This was not advice. This was not strategy. This was a command. Samuel reminded Saul of something that had happened long before he was born. He reminded him of the moment when Amalek attacked Israel in the wilderness, when they ambushed the weak, when they slaughtered the defenseless. And then Samuel delivered the words that must have sent a chill through the king's heart. God said the time had come. The centuries of patience were over. Now the judgment promised long ago would finally be carried out. The command recorded in the first book of Samuel was clear and uncompromising. Saul was to go to war against Amalek, and this would not be an ordinary battle. It would be the end of an entire people. The command said to destroy everything: men, women, children, infants, livestock, camels, donkeys, everything. Nothing was to survive. When people hear this passage today, it can feel overwhelming, even disturbing. But remember something crucial. This command came after centuries of violence and repeated attacks. Generation after generation of Amalekites had continued the same path, the same cruelty, the same hostility. Now God was bringing the story to its final chapter. Saul gathered his army. Thousands of soldiers assembled for the campaign. The moment that had been foretold for centuries was finally here. And as the army prepared to march, Saul sent a warning to another group living among the Amalekites, a tribe called the Kenites. The Kenites had once shown kindness to Israel during their journey through the wilderness. So Saul told them to leave the Amalekite territory before the battle began. It was a moment that showed something important. This was not blind destruction. This was targeted judgment. Once the Kenites moved away, Saul launched the attack. Israel's army swept through Amalekite territory from one end to the other. The battles were fierce, but the Amalekites were overwhelmed. Their cities fell. Their warriors were defeated. The prophecy spoken centuries earlier was unfolding. It looked like the story was about to end exactly as God had declared. But in the middle of victory, Saul made a decision that seemed small at the time, a decision that might even have felt reasonable to him, but it would change everything. Because Saul did something God had specifically forbidden. He spared someone. Not just anyone. He spared the king of the Amalekites, a man named Agag. Instead of executing him as commanded, Saul kept him alive. And that wasn't the only thing Saul allowed. His soldiers also kept the best livestock from the battle, the finest sheep, the healthiest cattle, the most valuable animals. Instead of destroying everything as commanded, they kept what looked useful, profitable, valuable. From Saul's perspective, it might not have seemed like disobedience. After all, the Amalekite army had been defeated, their cities destroyed, the war was won. But sometimes the most dangerous disobedience isn't open rebellion. Sometimes it's partial obedience, doing most of what God said, while quietly ignoring the parts that feel uncomfortable. And Saul had no idea that his decision had already reached heaven. God saw what had happened, and that night the prophet Samuel received a message that would shake the kingdom of Israel. God said something heartbreaking. He said he regretted making Saul king. The man chosen to carry out divine justice had failed to follow the command completely, and the consequences of that moment would echo far beyond Saul's lifetime. Because one survivor from Amalek's royal bloodline would eventually play a role in one of the most dangerous threats Israel would ever face. But before that happens, there is a confrontation coming. A confrontation between a prophet and a king. A moment where Saul will try to justify what he has done, and Samuel will deliver words that still echo through history. To obey is better than sacrifice. And what happens next will be one of the most dramatic scenes in the entire Bible. Chapter 4. The king who almost finished the story. The battle was over. Dust still hung in the air from marching soldiers. Broken weapons lay scattered across the ground, and the army of Saul had returned victorious. From a distance, it looked like the command of God had been carried out. The cities of the Amalekites had fallen. Their warriors were defeated. The centuries-old judgment that God had spoken about long ago seemed finally complete. But hidden inside that victory was a quiet act of disobedience. Because instead of finishing the command exactly as God had given it, Saul had made a decision that probably felt reasonable in the moment. He spared the Amalekite king, a man named Agag. Rather than executing him, Saul kept him alive. Maybe Saul wanted to parade him as proof of victory. Maybe he wanted the prestige of capturing a king. Maybe he simply didn't see why it mattered. But that wasn't the only thing that happened. Saul's soldiers looked over the spoils of war. Thousands of animals filled the captured camps. Sheep, cattle, the strongest, healthiest livestock. And instead of destroying them like God had commanded, the soldiers kept the best of them. The finest animals were spared. Only the weak and useless ones were destroyed. But what Saul didn't realize was that at that very moment, God was already speaking to someone else, far away from the battlefield. That night, the prophet Samuel received a message from God. And it was not a message of celebration, it was one of grief. God said something heartbreaking. He said he regretted making Saul king. Think about that. The man who had been chosen to lead Israel, the man who had been given authority and victory, had failed in the very mission God had entrusted to him. Samuel was devastated when he heard this. The Bible says he cried out to God all night long. Imagine the emotion in that moment. Samuel had been the one who anointed Saul. He had believed in him. He had seen potential in him, and now it was falling apart. The next morning, Samuel set out to find the king. When he finally arrived, Saul greeted him with confidence, almost proudly. Saul said something that must have sounded shocking to Samuel. He said, "I have carried out the Lord's command." But Samuel heard something, a sound that exposed the truth. In the distance, sheep were bleating, cattle were lowing. The very animals Saul was supposed to destroy were alive and filling the air with noise. So Samuel asked a simple question. If you have obeyed God, then what is this sound I hear? It was one of the most uncomfortable moments in biblical history. Saul immediately tried to explain. He blamed the soldiers. He said they had spared the best animals so they could sacrifice them to God. Listen carefully to that excuse. Saul wasn't saying they kept them for greed. He claimed they kept them for worship. but Samuel saw through it instantly. And then Samuel delivered words that still echo across generations. Recorded in the first book of Samuel, he said, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord?" Then came the line that has been repeated for thousands of years: "To obey is better than sacrifice." In other words, God did not want Saul to invent a better plan. God did not want him to improve the command. God simply wanted obedience. But Saul had chosen his own judgment instead. Samuel's next words were devastating. He told Saul that because he had rejected the command of God, God had rejected him as king. Imagine the silence that must have followed. The king of Israel, losing his kingdom in a single conversation. Saul panicked. He admitted he had sinned. But even in that moment, his concern revealed something about his heart. He begged Samuel to return with him so the elders of Israel would still honor him. Even after being rejected, Saul still worried about appearances. But Samuel had one more task to complete, because one piece of the command was still unfinished, and that piece was standing nearby. King Agag was brought before Samuel. Agag approached confidently, thinking the danger had passed. After all, Saul had spared him. He likely believed the worst was behind him. But Samuel spoke words that reflected the centuries of violence the Amalekites had caused. He said, "As your sword has made women childless, so your mother will be childless among women." And in one of the most dramatic moments in the Old Testament, Samuel executed Agag himself. The prophet finished the command that the king had failed to complete. After that moment, Samuel and Saul separated. The Bible says Samuel never saw Saul again for the rest of his life. And although Samuel continued to mourn for him, the kingdom had already begun moving toward a new leader. But here is where the story takes an even more chilling turn, because Saul's failure didn't just cost him the throne. His incomplete obedience left something alive, a remnant, a surviving thread of Amalek's bloodline. And generations later, that surviving thread would grow into a man who nearly succeeded in wiping out the entire Jewish people. His name was Haman. And the story of how he almost destroyed Israel unfolds in the book of Esther, which raises a haunting possibility. If Saul had fully obeyed God that day, would that threat have ever existed? Sometimes the consequences of one decision echo far beyond a single lifetime, and the shadow of Amalek was not finished yet.